et renovabis pacientere.
Oremus Deus, qui quadra fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione loquisti, da nobis in spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominium nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro
In
nobis.
nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So we continue on page 49. Mentioning that there were definitely some superstitious practices at this period. Just the fact that they were superstitious is quite clear. Just a brief examination of what they were. And that also at this time, see the first basis of the evil practice of dueling. And dueling in the strict sense of two people fighting with deadly weapons for the purpose of just settling some point of honor. Not to be confused with maybe two combatants in a larger battle, and they had just happened to be fighting each other one-on-one. That's something separate that might in some sense be referred to as dueling, but that is not necessarily condemned. Or two people representing different nations, that's not necessarily condemned. What is condemned is this combined murder and suicide of taking it upon oneself to seek to take life of somebody else over a point of honor and to expose oneself at that same time to grave danger of death or very serious bodily harm for really no reason, or at least over something that should be settled in some other way. It may be that there was some legitimate offense, some offense was legitimately taken due to somebody's insult, but that is not the way to settle it. Definitely not. The church always condemned that. We mentioned that it was excommunication for anybody who would engage in that, even for the people who would witness it. It's very specific. If you look at it in canon law, it's very specific. And also that they who died in a duel were to be denied Christian burial, denied the ceremonies of the church for putting someone to rest, unless they, of course, repented before actually dying, but lacking any signs of repentance, that person would be put in the ground as someone who died excommunicated. All right, so we said that what makes this, well, I think this is the next thing we're going on to here, what makes this blindness appear more stupid is the fact that these strange ordeals were used not only in cases of criminal charges, but in questions of law and order. So superstition made its way even into the legal system, legal proceedings. When the question arose in Germany, say whether the representation should proceed in a direct line, it was decided by single combat. When the Spanish church was hesitating between Roman and Mozarabic liturgies. Both books were cast into the flames, which were expected to decide the case by sparing the ritual approved of heaven. So that is tempting God, getting him to seeking from God some kind of action that he does not normally carry out. That could be seeking some extraordinary favor, asking for some extraordinary grace that we ought not to be asking for. So, for example, to be asked to be raised to the same sanctity as Our Lady herself would be to ask for those graces, for the graces necessary for that would be to tempt God. Because God gave her special graces for very specific reasons, extraordinary gifts, not meant for everybody. And so to ask for that is to ask that God give gifts that he does not ordinarily give. To ask him to do something he does not usually do, and therefore to tempt him. And God certainly can work miracles, and it's not necessarily sinful to ask for something, to ask that perhaps that a miracle be worked, but to count on some extraordinary intervention of God is to tempt him, as is being done in these cases. Now, it could potentially be, yes, somehow that God manifests his will in some unusual fashion, but men cannot demand that of him. That is to tempt God. There are many ways potentially of tempting God. It's called that, whereas not in the same sense, obviously, as that in which the devil might tempt man, or man might expose himself to an occasion of sin and feel temptation to sin. God cannot sin, obviously, but it's to tempt him to, in the sense of testing what he will do. So that is forbidden. So it's sinful to tempt God. Or it could also, another way of tempting God might be to neglect to study for exams, but then still expect to do well on them. Just pray. Just pray. Please give me the infused knowledge necessary to do well on these exams. That would be to tempt God. Definitely pray for it'd be very, very good to pray for whatever assistance is necessary to do well. That's fine. But the way St. Augustine puts it is this, that we have to pray as though everything depended upon God, because, ultimately it does. But we have to act as if everything depended upon ourselves. So, yes, God will grant us graces, definitely. We'll get into that hopefully a little bit later today. Talk more about how grace and free will and all that works. Well, we won't go into the full dogmatic tract on it, but we'll enter into it to some extent. Yes, God does grant us graces, and we have to freely cooperate with those graces. So, the Council of Attigny denounced these superstitious practices with great vigor, and the watchful zeal of the popes, assisted in this case, meaning by the imperial authority, soon blotted out these disgraceful stains from European legislation and manners. Indeed. So notice that all of this was genuinely superstitious that this age was seeing, but it was condemned by the church as such and rooted out with the assistance of the civil power. The people who accuse the church of being superstitious don't know what they're talking about. You'll see that most of the time, almost always. Accusations against the church are based on an ignorance of various historical incidents or various scenarios. Now, whether or not that person is culpably ignorant or not is another question, any given person who might level those accusations. But it's all based on a twisted version of perhaps real events. Sometimes it might just be completely made up. For example, that was in Galileo, that he supposedly said after being pressured to to walk back certain things that he was saying, that as he walked out of the room, he said defiantly under his breath, "But it does move," referring to his position concerning the celestial bodies, referring to the earth. That he supposedly said that's just made up. Voltaire just made that up. So sometimes it's just completely fabrication. That was the church suppressing science or something like that, which is utter nonsense. When you actually study all the assistance that the church was given even to the lower sciences, that's complete nonsense. But as we've said many times, the church is constantly occupied with the most important of all sciences, what I call the most scientific of all sciences, sacred theology. that involves the greatest difficulty and the highest truths. The church is constantly occupied with that. So anybody who accuses the church of being opposed to progress of science in any true sense, it just shows the extreme extent of his own ignorance and lack of understanding of the most important things. That's the only thing anybody has ever proven by leveling such accusations. Not to mention, in many cases, also a tremendous pride. Thinking, oh, that these low sciences can disprove the church, which is, the absurdity of that is so tremendous it hardly deserves to be commented on. Could not possibly be obviously that a lower science could disprove a higher science. It also means that everybody can benefit, obviously. Anybody who is engaged in anything that might be described as a scientific field can do very well from having, well, obviously from the virtue of faith for many reasons. That's necessary for eternal salvation. But also just in his own field, he can benefit because he's protected by those higher truths. If he's ever tempted to reach some conclusion that could possibly contradict what he knows to be true by faith, he knows immediately, okay, that's not the case. And he's kept safe from at least certain mistakes in his own field. Potentially. Depends. You have to take it case by case. But potentially that provides him further protection. Now if they rethink, okay, I already know that that's not true, I just have to now see where I went wrong. He's already aware of that. A mistake that he otherwise might not realize ever. And also, it's also true, St. Thomas talks about it, why everybody can benefit from a study of philosophy, which is the highest of the natural sciences. That every lower science obviously can be helped by that. Anybody who's engaged in a lower science will definitely be safeguarded if he has a sound knowledge of true philosophy. We're not talking about the garbage Enlightenment philosophical systems or any other philosophical errors that have arisen through time, but true sound philosophy, which of course the church is. That is the kind of philosophy that the church actually even requires. Pope Leo XIII even put down various different philosophical doctrines that everybody is required to hold. Okay, so you see more on that in different courses and down the line, but just be aware of that. So while the West thus bowed to the gentle violence of the faith, the East presented a vastly different sight, as usual. Leo the Armenian had banished all the Catholic bishops and abbots. He ordered all the paintings in the churches to be destroyed, and the workmen who executed his orders were worthy to be classed with the Vandals by the destruction of so many masterpieces of art. So the Vandals were, in fact, a barbarian tribe. That was the name of a barbarian tribe that sacked Rome once. And that's how the term Vandal came to have its current meaning. You do things that the Vandals did, you're a Vandal. It used to just be another name for another tribe. You have the Saxons and the Franks, etc., also the Vandals and the Goths, etc. But now Vandal has come to mean, of course, Goth has come to have another modern meaning, which has nothing to do with the Gothic tribes of past centuries, past millennia even at this point. But it does have to do with, the term Vandal does have something to do with the ancient Vandal tribes. It had to do with their conduct. Also, the Avars were another tribe, from which we get the term avaricious, because that's what they would do. They would steal wealth and treasure, etc., and just bury it in the ground, not do anything with it after that. Just like avaricious people do. So, sacred vessels which were represented, on which were represented pious subjects were broken. We see that many beautiful chalices might have some depictions of our Lord, of saints in some cases. We have some chalices that have the 12 apostles on them, for example. So all things iconoclasts would not like. So sacred vessels were broken, that's sacrilegious, obviously. The paintings executed on wood disappeared under the blows of an axe, and the remains were burned in the public square. All this sacrilegious. The emperor, not satisfied with silencing the defenders of the truth by banishment, wished to win them over to his cause and thus seduce the faithful by their example. So, I can go past some of this, but the point is he's continuing on with this. So, move on now to the pontificate of Eugenius II, who was elected pope on the 5th of June, 824, and by his charity won the title of Father of the People. In Constantinople, Michael the Stammerer, who was an agent of Leo, Leo the Armenian, in perpetrating the persecutions of iconoclasm. So had not granted a long truce to the faithful. He belonged, so let's see. I move on past that. It just keeps going. You know that this persecution keeps on going. See all right, so that had to be noticed on page 50, further elucidation of what exactly is meant by the term adorare, because that can be used in a very broad sense. It can even be used in some cases, the term adorare, just to mean, say, a bow of respect, just a normal, not having nothing to do with the worship of latria, but just having to do with, say, someone might give a bow, one person to another, just as a bow of greeting, that might be referred to. If it's done with a sense of respect, if someone, you're doing that to someone of higher rank, that might be referred to as adorare. You might potentially use the Latin verb adorare for that, potentially. It's not a good idea to, certainly not since the church has adopted that term and given it a very specific sense, but you might see that sometimes, even in sacred scripture that used that way. So we're not saying it's a bad idea that sacred scripture should have that term, that Latin translations of it should use that. But if you're using that term yourself to adore, then that's pretty, especially in English, that's pretty well restricted to latria, adore. To adore means to, the obvious sense of it is that, to give the worship that is due to God alone. And so we have to use that only with regard to God himself, in fact. So the mere veneration and latria had not been distinguished in the Council of Frankfurt. So you notice that all of the vocabulary that we have now very well defined and clearly laid out for us, we have, is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear it. That's the sense in which the church uses it. We're the beneficiaries of many, many centuries of the development, so to speak, of that. Development in a true sense, in a good sense, of the expression of doctrine. The modernists talk about the development of dogma to mean that it evolves into changes into something else. That's heresy. That's condemned by St. Pius. That's heresy, just plain and simple. That notion, that doctrine can change. But what is true and what is not heresy is to say that that it's possible for the things to become more clearly stated over time, better explained, and for the vocabulary that is used to express it to become standardized. That's fine. In fact, it's very good. And it's one reason why the church uses Latin, which is very precise. Clearly defines various Latin terms to mean different things. Even if in the dictionary you might find many different meanings for it, the church nails down very specific meanings for things. All right, so the council assembled at Paris in 825. By Louis the Mild threw no new light upon the subject. The bishops mainly endeavored to show that the worship of latria is not to be paid to holy images, at least not in a sense is paid to God himself immediately. Certain images, say, of our Lord might still be, but in the proper sense. But you see more of that in other courses. They collected all the texts from the fathers that bear upon the point. So yes, no image obviously is God himself. Still, they would seem to have been but lightly acquainted with the state of things in the East, and their ignorance is easily explained by the difficulty of communication, not yet established by navigation or commerce, and by the want of serious historical studies. So Eugenius II died in 827, shortly after the closing of the council, and was buried in the Vatican. So next comes the pontificate of Pope Valentine, who reigned for just a few weeks, a little over a month. So there's not too much to say about his reign. So we'll move on to Gregory IV. The apostolic chair was filled by him, who's obviously taking the same name as St. Gregory the Great. He had fled to a monastery when he was borne by the whole people and spited himself to the pontifical throne. So that sometimes happens. Someone elected to be pope doesn't want it, at least refuses at first, even if he does sometimes agree later on. You'll see that we're within a couple centuries in our timeline of seeing this, 200 or 300 years or so. But Pope Victor III would at first be elected and refuse, and then in a similar manner to this, be brought from the Abbey of Monte Cassino where he was the abbot, and more or less extracted and brought to Rome. But then even after that, after a few days, he said, no, I'm not doing this, and left again. It was finally prevailed upon after a year to accept the papacy. And then he finally became pope without any further election. And yes, we who hold to the thesis say that this is a practical case in point of all the principles of the thesis being put into action in a concrete historical example. And the author, I mean, this is just taken straight from one particular author. We're going to get the exact quote for anybody who might want to see it. But that is, the author explains it very clearly, explicitly, that he was not. He was elected. It was a true election. The designation was carried out, but he refused to accept it. So he didn't receive any authority. But then after a year, even after all that refusal, once he accepted it, then he received the authority without any further election being carried out. And that is exactly what we described in the thesis. Yeah, the reason why the Vatican II, quote-unquote, popes don't have authority is for a different reason than Pope Victor III. He had the faith. He was a true pope. It was never a question of that. Once he accepted the papacy, there was no other obstacle. We say the reason why the current claimants don't receive authority it's a different reason why, but still, it's very much a similar situation. Someone who has a designation but not yet the authority, if ever at all. All right, so the shameless inertness of the iconoclast emperors of Constantinople had allowed the Saracen power to grow into formidable proportions. Masters of the richest provinces of the east, of Egypt and of Africa, commanding the Mediterranean by their strongholds in the archipelago, they made Sicily and Spain, those two gates of the west, their advanced posts against all Christendom. So the only power that could have stayed their invading march was the Empire of the Franks, but Louis the Mild was satisfied with having driven them beyond his frontier to the Pyrenees, and did not concern himself about enemies who were not immediately in his way. And so the Pyrenees are the mountain range that separate France from Spain. And where there is actually, this has happened, sometimes people in that area speak a kind of combination of French and Spanish, which is actually Saint Bernadette, the visionary of Saint Bernadette of Subaru, what's her name? The visionary of Lourdes. She had to, and when she entered the monastery, convent, she became a religious. She died religious. When she entered the convent, she had to learn French. Even though she was a citizen of France, she actually had to learn proper French because she grew up speaking this combination of French and Spanish, which actually was the dialect in which Our Lady spoke to her. So when you look at obviously Our Lady very famously said, "I am the Immaculate Conception," at that apparition, which proved that it was a true apparition. That proved it, because Saint Bernadette was just a fact. She was not the brightest student. She didn't, at age 14, she didn't know her catechism well enough to receive Holy Communion. And when you hear something like that about a saint, you think, oh, it's just a question of somebody failing to recognize this as a saint before him, etc., etc. No, she genuinely didn't know her catechism well enough, and that's perfectly normal that someone who doesn't know the catechism not be allowed to receive the sacraments. Now, she eventually did learn it well enough, but she was 14 years old and still couldn't. And so the point is that when she said that all this lady told me I'm the Immaculate Conception, she obviously had no idea what that meant. And she could not possibly have made that up. So that's when the priest heard that, okay, I think it's a true apparition. That's not something this could have possibly invented. Because she didn't even know what it meant. I tried to ask what does it even mean. But when you look at those actual words that Our Lady, that she actually spoke, it was in a kind of a combination of French and Spanish pronunciation. The two languages that are fairly similar, obviously, are very similar in many ways, but definitely have different pronunciation systems. All right, so yes, at this point, the Saracens, or as they would become known to be later in Spain, the Moors, indeed have been driven farther south. They're not in France currently, but that's as far as the current King of France is willing to fight against them. Charlemagne, in leaving him the scepter, could not bequeath his genius with it, and the unfortunate emperor would soon have enough to do to resist the attacks of his own sons. So this is actually a fairly common occurrence that the successors of some great man, and certainly in many senses Charlemagne was a great man, many times their successors are somewhat lacking because, well, strong personalities tend to surround themselves with weak personalities. They tend to. It's not an infallible guarantee that they will, but there's a tendency that they do. And the reason is they don't want any competition. So they surround themselves with people who are of relatively weak will and relatively blank personalities. And they do that because they won't push back. They'll just go with the program, so to speak. Whereas other strong characters might have other ideas and might put up some serious opposition. If there's one thing that strong characters dislike, it's opposition. Any block, anything in the way of their agenda, they will react violently to that. On the other hand, it's only other strong personalities for which they have any respect. They might surround themselves with these relatively weak personality yes men, but they have no respect for those people. They only have respect for other strong personalities. But it means that they tend to lift up weak personalities and to put them in, but they are themselves are in positions of power. The strong personalities they tend to surround themselves with and to put into other positions, subservient to their own, but still high positions, people of weak personality. And so they end up succeeding them in power, typically, meaning that the legacy, the long-term legacy of even a truly great man might be a lackluster series of successors. Potentially. It's not guaranteed, but many times it results in that. And Charlemagne, yes, his immediate successors were nothing like him. Very much lost in his shadow, so to speak. So the papacy was thus left the sole bulwark of Christendom, and then appeared the wisdom of the providential plan which had given it an independent temporal domain. So we're seeing the beginnings of the papal states here. And it's very good that the church have its own independent temporal domain in which the Holy See resides, that the city of Rome itself be independent of any state, besides the papal states. That's a good thing, because remember, it avoids ever giving the impression that the papacy is some functionality, just some function of some state, which is the impression that was definitely given when the papacy resided in France. Even when those popes, at Avignon specifically, even though those popes had understandable motives for wanting to be in France as opposed to in Rome, the Roman mob was being particularly troublesome in those times. But it's not a good thing. And what the thing to do is to bring that under control somehow. Or if the city of Rome itself is really uninhabitable because of that, then maybe go someplace else outside of Rome, but still stay as close as possible to it. But going to France was, even though many of those popes were French and therefore very much attached to France, still a bad idea to go there and make that the semi-permanent residence of the papacy, because that gives a bad impression. In a sense that offends the Catholicity of the church, that the Pope should do that. Right? It's not in itself evil that the Pope should ever travel, but really belongs in Rome. It belongs in the actual city that is the See of St. Peter. Okay, so the papacy, Gregory IV understood his mission. He opposed with all the means in his power to the incursions of the Muslim fleets on the coast of Italy, in Calabria, Tuscany, and even in Lombardy. You see the problem that this is presenting currently. As a protection to the mouth of the Tiber, if the hostile fleets found an easier landing, he undertook an immense labor. So this is one of the disadvantages of the positioning of Rome, that it is easy to attack. Even if you've ever been to Rome, obviously, you may have seen the walls around Rome, but it's that didn't do too much, obviously. Rome was besieged and taken multiple times. It's a very low-lying area. It's a bit of a mystery why Rome was founded exactly where it was, but there it is. You see why the Emperor Constantine decided to move the capital to some place more easily defensible. Rome is definitely in need of having measures taken for its protection. But meanwhile, a lamentable revolution was preparing in the Frankish Empire. The Council of Paris had offered Louis a wise counsel, with which he did not, however, avail himself. It is the greatest obstacle to order, said the council, is the gradual interference of princes with ecclesiastical matters, while bishops, whether through ignorance or cupidity, give more attention than is proper to temporal affairs. So that this can happen, and even in an ordered situation, that it's possible that such things happen. So that was already warning flags going up about interference of the state in matters of the church that would later develop into Gallicanism, which we'll see. But really an exaggerated notion of the privileges of the church in France. Members of the church in France. So, Pontificate of Sergius II, now, he was raised to the chair of St. Peter in 844, January of 844, without waiting the arrival of the Emperor Lothar's deputies. This haste was warranted by the peculiar exigency of the times, which, remember, the Pope is not bound to give notice to anybody of his own election, to any, that is to say, specifically any civil ruler. He might do it for reasons of prudence, but is not bound to it anyway. A deacon named John had gathered a factious crowd to oppose Sergius and gain his own promotion to the papacy by open violence. He had already broken into the Lateran palace with an armed force and gave reason to fear the most alarming excesses as a consequence of his schism. The nobility of Rome at once rose in defense of the lawful pontiff. So we have someone who's trying to insert himself as an anti-pope here. The mob was dispersed. The schismatic deacon was subjected to close confinement and only owed his life to the clemency and urgent solicitations of Sergius II. So notice his charity there. That very definitely it's a very bad thing, very sinful thing to try to insert oneself as an anti-pope. Obviously, that is to be an instigator of schism and or a perpetuator of it, as the case might be. But even then, he doesn't want the crowd to lynch him, so to speak. No, that's not the way to deal with this. So that is true charity towards one's enemy there. The measures adopted by the Empress Theodora for the conversion of the Manichaeans or Paulicians, who desolated the churches of the Eastern Empire, were not crowned with the same happy result. So Manichaeans have been around. That's a heresy that's been around for a while. Remember, St. Augustine, before his conversion, fell into it. He was a Manichae for a time before his conversion. So really, if there was a sin to commit before his conversion, St. Augustine committed it. Pretty much. I mean, he made no secret of it himself. He wrote a whole book of his confessions. Notice that the church also does not hide the fact that some saints, even great saints, were once great sinners. Because not only does that no shame to the church, but it shows that what the grace of God can do, can transform a great sinner, into being a great saint. In fact, that's typically what happens. If a great sinner ever converts, then he typically becomes a great saint. Or I guess better way to put it, great saints in many cases were once great sinners. Because they were many of them being very strong personalities, very much committed to whatever it is they do. At one time committed themselves to sin, but then being moved by grace, instead committed themselves to pursuing sanctity, and very much turned their wills instead, under the influence of grace, but turned their wills to cooperating with grace towards attaining sanctity. So their natural qualities definitely, might say, playing some part there. Even if, yes, it is only because of grace that they converted, because of grace that they cooperated with grace, still their natural qualities were put to use in that. So the mildness, also the Manichaeism would stick around in the form of Albigensianism that was really just a reheated form of Manichaeism that would reappear in southern France later on. Which itself was, all of this is heavy influence of Gnosticism. So it's really, notice that heretics are very, very rarely ever original. Martin Luther himself was not exactly original. We'll see that down the line, but Martin Luther himself was not original. What he did was he made various ideas very popular and fomented uprisings against both the church and state. That's what he was, really a rabble-rouser. That was where his abilities lay. I mean, he misused them, obviously, but his abilities really lay in being a charismatic speaker. That's where he was really talented, and he put that to crooked use for sure. So supported by the Saracen power, they, that is, these heretics, came forth from their retreat in the city of Argaus in Armenia and made frequent inroads upon the territory of the empire. Notice that, heretics being subversive of the civil order. They're just rebels. Heretics are just rebels. And here they're rebelling against the civil power, against the imperial authority in the east in this case. Theodora sent a considerable force against them, and many of them paid for their plunder with their lives. Also, there were wars fought against the Albigensians in France. In fact, Saint Dominic was even involved in helping to raise forces to go and fight them. That's how much of a problem they were. So that really crusades were fought. I mean, those following the heading of crusades, wars fought for religious purposes. In this case, in a true sense, religious purposes, for the purpose of preserving the faith in a particular place. Those heretics were really problematic. You see why the monarchs for such a long time treated heretics as same as they would treat someone who, say, betrayed state secrets to a hostile power. They were treated as people who committed treason, as indeed it is. That's actually worse. That's a greater offense against the harmony of the state, you might say, to foment heresy than it is to betray secrets to the enemy. And so the doctrine of community of property and equality of condition had many points of resemblance, or their doctrine, with various systems reproduced in more modern times under the name of socialism. Once again, people who peddle errors are usually not original. There are very few novel ideas in that sense, ever, even amongst heretics. There are some ideas, you heard this or that heresy, then where did that idea come from? But usually those are flops of heresies, because if it's really an original heresy, so to speak, some crazy false idea that was fabricated as a new thing at a certain point, usually if it's truly original, it doesn't provide any excuse for sin, and then nobody has any motive to adopt it, and so it just fails, disappears. There are a couple of examples of that, but the point is that heresies are usually all, instigated for the same reasons, for the same base motives, meaning that things that they try to justify are always the same, which means that it's always the same errors that come up to try to justify the same sins again and again and again. And you notice constantly amongst heretics, there's the Manichees, various, the errors that preceded Manichaeism, the Manichees themselves, and the errors that came after them, all in that same family of errors and heresies, as we can look upon it. There's always this commonly occurring thing that the perfect people who have reached the highest levels of perfection don't have to observe the moral law anymore. So there's this constant making excuse for sins, the gravest sins against the virtue of chastity. Essentially, they're seeing themselves as dispensed from that. So you see, constantly you see these excuses for sin. That's usually the motive for heresy. Excuse for sin. That was certainly the case of Martin Luther himself. Definitely. And why also one of the ways he managed to survive was by allowing other people to sin. Allowing in the sense of telling him it was okay. So, the leaders of this sect soon found themselves surrounded by a host of worthless outcasts and malcontents, naturally drawn into a system of extreme radicalism, destructive of all principle, government, or form of society. Again, underscoring the fact that heretics are just rebels. People who are attracted to heresy are rebellious. They became the terror of the East and were powerful enough to build two cities, Amara and Tibricus. From this time their fury knew no bounds. The remnants of the iconoclast party were more easily reconciled to the church. So eventually the iconoclasts were reconciled to the church. That took a long time. And even then it seems, under certain pressure of greater dangers looming still. At least greater dangers to the state still looming. St. Methodius, Patriarch of Constantinople, treated them with the most merciful indulgence, retaining in their sees the bishops who abjured their error, and in all things following the true spirit of the gospel. So that is something that the church can allow. And then if St. Methodius was allowing it, and then it was allowed to stand, that was presumably with the approval of the Holy See. The Holy See can allow that. Bishops who were once heretics, maybe even consecrated in schism, for example, to retain their sees or to become legitimate in those sees. The church can allow that. Ordinarily, that's not supposed to be done. There's a general principle that if you receive orders nefariously, then you're not allowed to exercise those, especially at the higher levels of authority in the hierarchy of the church, especially when it comes to being a bishop of a diocese or a patriarch of a prominent diocese or something like that. Usually, someone who receives orders nefariously receives most of all episcopal consecration for the purpose of intruding upon a see would be forbidden to exercise those orders that he received. And that's a good principle because it's also a general principle that nobody should ever benefit from evil doing. That's why, for example, in many cases, a case which the church also has the authority to do, to reduce a priest to the lay state, he's still a priest, so still objectively the character cannot be erased from the soul, but in many cases of a priest being reduced to the lay state, he would not be allowed to marry. The church could allow that, but if it was a penal thing, then the church would not give him the freedom to marry, nor dispense him from the obligation of reciting the office. Or even in cases where he might be a priest being reduced to the lay state, he might be allowed to marry, still would be required to recite the office. And the idea being, there's still something there of ordination. But in a penal case, nothing would be allowed, because nobody should be rewarded in any sense for evil doing. Because otherwise, then someone might be inclined to commit a crime, because of which he would be reduced to the lay state, but hey, don't see the office anymore and get to marry. It might be a motive for that. The idea being that evil should never be incentivized in any way. Evil doing should never be rewarded. So also when someone receives an episcopal consecration for the purpose of intruding into a see, he should not be in any sense rewarded for that, should not be allowed to become legitimate in that ever. That's a general principle. The church can grant an exception to that for the sake of the greater good, for the good of souls. That is the overarching principle of all, that the salvation of souls is the highest law. That's a principle according to which we know our apostolate today is justified. So that's the reason also, the same motive for which the church sometimes allows an intruder bishop to become legitimate. Sometimes it makes an intruder bishop to be legitimate. Once an intruder, now legitimate. Made so by the authority of the church for the sake of some greater good. So the saint was followed by a worthy and no less illustrious successor in the person of St. Ignatius, who showed his attachment to the center of Catholic unity, meaning, of course, the Holy See, with the constancy of a saint raised up by God to hinder or at least delay the consummation of the Eastern Schism. So the time of Photius is not far in the future. It was the first one to really form a whole schismatic sect. Because the East has been in and out of schism, but hasn't really formed a sect, properly so called, yet. Photius would become very closely associated with that, with forming a sect. So, his happy pontificate is contemporaneous with two other equally cheering episodes in the history of religion, the conversion of the Khazars and the Moravians. So, their worship was a mixture of Judaism and Mohammedanism. The petition to the Empress Theodora for Catholic missionaries was answered by St. Ignatius, who at once sent to them the priest Constantine, called the Philosopher, the envoy of the church, invoked upon his mission by a powerful patronage by a similar name of Cyril. So the conversion of the whole nation was the reward of his earnest zeal. The Moravians, a people of the Slavonic race, occupied present various areas there. Cyril, on his return from his first mission, at once set out for Moravia, accompanied by his brother St. Methodius. With these two holy brothers, these people received the twofold light of faith and civilization. So these are the famous Saints Cyril and Methodius, who we notice were Greek, which is why they evangelized the Slavs, which is actually, and gave them a writing system as well, which is where the Cyrillic alphabet comes from. That's named for Saint Cyril. If you look at it side by side with the Greek alphabet, you notice many similarities. That's because St. Cyril, being Greek, whose name that alphabet bears, was the one who invented it. So he based it on the Greek alphabet. And it actually works quite well. I could not claim to be an expert in Slavic languages, but it's you can see, just looking at Polish, for example, which is the only Slavic language that uses the Latin alphabet. When you look at that, you can see why the Cyrillic alphabet is well suited to Slavic languages, because the reason why Polish uses all those combinations of consonants, and when you look at a Polish word and think, how on earth do you pronounce that? It's because those combinations of consonants are really standing in place of Cyrillic characters. They were Poles, yes, they're probably the most westernized of all these Slavic nations. They adopted the Latin alphabet, and it's fine, it works for them. But the Cyrillic alphabet is since custom made for the pronunciation of those sounds. Whereas the Latin alphabet, the closest thing you can get to it is combining various consonants together. So the Cyrillic alphabet was custom made for that. Okay, so they gave to the Moravians their alphabet, as we said, and the translations of the sacred writings. Thus do the Slavs, recognize in them at once their apostles and the fathers of their literature. Meanwhile, Pope Sergius II had died at Rome on the 27th of January, 847. His last days, like those of his predecessor, Gregory IV, were embittered by the ruinous inroads, of the Normans and the Muslims. So the Normans are Norsemen, Vikings, marauders, at this point still pagans, who under Ragnar Lodbrog, that sounds like a barbarous name, appeared before the very walls of Paris, whose weak monarch, Charles the Bald, that's an unfortunate way to be known, purchased with gold the safety of his capital. Even if you are in fact bald, that's an unfortunate way to be. Go down in history. Another time there's also Philip the Fat, that's even worse. So Charles the Bald is not the strongest leader. Purchased with gold the safety of his capital. That's why you look at, to this day, there is a region of France that the Normans actually settled in permanently called Normandy, in fact. Famous for many things, but most recently, World War II, the Normandy landings, that was where the British, the Americans, and also Canadian forces were connected with the British Army, landed in June of 1944. That was the region of France. The reason why they landed there was, that's another story, but they did in fact land there in this region that was eventually had been given many centuries earlier by the King of France to the Normans, to raiding Vikings. So he bought them off, essentially, gave them territory, and allowed them to settle very close to Paris, in fact. So these spoilers were the terror of the Franks, who neither dared to fight them nor to till the soil. The region between the Seine and Loire rivers became overspread with dense forests. So the Loire River, that's also another famous one. But the Seine is the river that flows through Paris. And in fact, once during the 1870-1871 Franco-Prussian War, the only way, when the Prussians besieged Paris, one of the few ways of getting word out of the city was for the French they started floating letters down the Seine River to hope someone would pick them up downstream. That's the river that flows through. The point is, that's the river that flows through Paris. So in the month of 846, month of August of 846, the African Saracens, who became known as Moors, that's in Spain, that's how they became known, ascended the Tiber in light vessels, forced the passage of Ostia, and covered the Roman territory with their swarming legions. Defended by the walls begun by Gregory IV and finished by Sergius II, Rome resisted the attacks of the infidels. The pillaged churches of St. Peter and St. Paul, not yet enclosed within the city bounds. They pillaged, that should be, the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul. All the ornaments and wealth of these splendid temples, even the silver altar over St. Peter's tomb, became the Muslims' spoil. At this critical period, death deprived the Romans of a wise and capable leader in the person of Sergius II. So, we're almost out of time here, but the next pontificate, St. Leo IV, who was elected in 847, at the end of January, was, notice they elected with the unanimous voice of the Roman clergy and people. So sometimes that happens. That's one way of choosing a pope. It's just everybody agrees all at the same time that all right, this man should be the next pope. That sometimes happens. All right, more on that next time. Et Spiritus Sancti, amen, subtuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix, nostras supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus et periculis conjunctis, libera nos semper vigorios et benedicta. Amen. In Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.